Hey, what's going on there, guys? Nick here from Absolute MTG, and I'm bringing you a deck tech for Blue, Red Fairies, and Modern. Now, contrary to that name, this is actually not a tribal-based deck like people may assume. This is actually more of a Delver-style tempo deck, where we have counter burn to be able to manipulate what our opponent's doing with our burn spells, and then the counter spells to just go and outright counter the things that they're trying to do, or at least delay them. And with that, we also have this small Faeries theme where it actually gets its name for the deck. And we have Spellstutter Sprite, which is going to allow us to counter spells based on the amount of Faeries that we have on the battlefield. We have Vendilion Clique, which is going to allow us to disrupt our opponent's hand, take a look at it, and then we're going to be able to send something back to the bottom of their library if it's valuable enough and force them to draw a new card. And we also have Mutavault, which Mutavault is a 2/2 creature when animated that has all creature types, and one of those creature types is a fairy, which plays into our Spellstutter Sprite. So, before we get to taking a look at this entire deck, if you guys have any suggestions for deck techs that you would like to see, please leave them down in the comments below. And be sure to check out the playlist in the description where I have all the previous decks that I've covered on the channel categorized for you, so you can check those out. So, starting off with our creatures in this deck, we have Delver of Secrets as a playset. I mentioned it's a Delver-based tempo deck. Of course, we're going to be playing him, and he's a 1/1 for 1 blue, and at the beginning of our upkeep, we look at the top card of our library. We can reveal that card, and if the revealed card is an instant or sorcery, we get to flip him into his 3/2 flying self on the flip side. So being able to invest 1 blue mana and getting a 3/2 flyer is just really enormous and is exactly what we want to be doing in a tempo-based deck. We have the playset of Spellstutter Sprite, so it doesn't look like a really enormous type of card or something that is just really favorable in a tempo-based deck, but it actually is. It's a 1/1 for 2 mana, 1 generic and 1 blue. It has flash and flying, and whenever it enters the battlefield, we can counter target spell with converted mana cost X, where X is, or X or less, where X is the number of fairies that we control. I always forget the X or less part about it. It's not exact, but Spellstutter Sprite is going to allow us on its own to counter out stuff like Path to Exile, Lightning Bolt. If we want to get a little bit bigger than that in terms of converted mana cost, it's Lightning Helix, Mana Leak, Remand, Tarmogoyf, Dark Confidant. There's just a lot of different stuff that Vendilion Clique is good at being able to counter. Now, of course, the more fairies we have, the bigger range we have with stuff that we can counter, but just on its own, being able to counter out lightning bolts and stuff like Path to Exile whenever it gets into like the mid to late game when we're actually swinging with our creatures and our opponent is trying to match what we're doing in terms of responses to our creatures and whatnot. So the Spellstutter Sprite ends up being a perfect card to have in this type of a deck. We have a playset of Snapcaster Mage, so Snapcaster is going to allow us to recur the spells that we have in our deck, so our instants and our sorceries. So this could mean getting back like a counter spell, this could mean getting back a burn spell to either get rid of one of our opponent's creatures or to just burn our opponent directly, but either way, Snapcaster Mage is awesome. We can flash him in at the end of the turn and have another attacking body the following turn, so definitely really cool to have him in this type of a deck, and it definitely plays into the whole Delver theme because we're already running a lot of instants and sorceries to interact with Delver. We are more than likely going to be playing Snapcaster Mage along with it as well. We have 3 Vendilion Clique, so our big fat legendary creature that's just a 3/1 for 3 with flying and flash, but being able to take a look at your opponent's hand and potentially being able to like throw something to the bottom of their library is really nice, especially when your opponent has that one card that really can just trump the situation and then you just put it on the bottom of their library and force them to draw. That is a lot of value for you, and usually most times whatever they draw is going to be less than favorable than what they just sent to the bottom of their library. There are situations where they draw something equally as good, but with Vendilion Clique, we just want to see what our opponent has and just kind of disrupt what's going on. We have a playset of Remand to be able to counter-target spell, and we send it back to its opponent's hand, but we also get to draw a card, so it's more of a card that delays what's going on, and in a tempo-based deck, it's alright to have that type of a card where we're just delaying things instead of actually hard countering them out where our opponent's not going to be able to recast them, but especially for big things, like whenever we get into like the Tron matchups on Game 2, Game 3, being able to counter something and then being able to drop like Blood Moon or something else like that and just throw off their Tron lands is definitely a lot of value. It keeps us on tempo with playing with decks that are just trying to cheat things or do things a lot earlier. So Remand is definitely pretty perfect for that. Also, being able to draw cards is good. Cantrips are always nice in this type of a deck. We have a playset of Mana Leak, so a little bit more consistent with countering things out. It's going to counter a target spell unless its controller pays 3 mana, and it's only 2 to cast. Makes it perfect for our curve here. We have 2 Spell Snare, which is a little bit more specific on what we can actually counter. It's going to counter target spell with converted mana cost 2, and it's only 1 blue to cast, and we have 2 of them. This is a little bit more specific to the variety of matchups you may face. I mentioned before things like Mana Leak, Remand, Tarmogoyf, Dark Confidant. Those are all valid things, especially when you get into the early matchups, or the early turns in the matchups against like Control, where you try to do something and your opponent just goes and Mana Leaks something that you're trying to do. Being able to Spell Snare it is definitely a good response whenever you have that 1 blue mana open. Same goes with like Negate if you're trying to, I don't know, cast like Burst Lightning with a kicker and your opponent just goes and negates it or something like that. So Spell Snare is a little bit more specific. It sides out a lot, but it's still really, really good. We have 2 Electrolyze, which deals 2 damage divided as we choose among any number of target creatures and or players, and we draw a card. So Electrolyze is good against like Lingering Souls, any small creatures that we can just get rid of outright, Dark Confidants, anything like that. We can just distribute the damage however we want. We can just deal that damage to our opponent as well if they just have 1 creature with 1 toughness, and we can just deal 1 to our opponent, ping them, ping their creature, draw a card for 3. Pretty alright. We have 2 Vedalken Shackles. So Vedalken Shackles is one of the cards that I really, really love to play in blue heavy decks. It's a 3-cost artifact, and we can choose not to untap it during our untap step. For 2 mana, tap, gain control of target creature with power less than or equal to the number of islands we control for as long as Shackles remains tapped. So up against any aggro-based deck, anything that's running a lot of creatures, we can just steal our opponent's creatures and use them as blockers or use them as something that's going to trade off with their other creatures or take their most valuable creature that they have on the board. Shackles is just really, really good, and it's reusable, so if our opponent plays something bigger, we can just have it untap and then take that bigger creature, provided that we have enough islands on the battlefield that we can take that creature. So Shackles is awesome. Also, one thing to remember with Shackles is that it doesn't check power and toughness after you take the creature, only whenever you're initially taking the creature. So if your opponent tries to go on like giant growth once you already have control of the creature or something like that, you don't lose control of it. Just something to keep in mind. We have a playset of Lightning Bolt, and Lightning Bolt is just really traditional. Deals 3 damage for just 1 red. Then we have Pillar of Flame. So Pillar of Flame is a little bit more specific for the hate that it actually provides. This is going to be for cards like Kitchen Finks, anything like Voice of Resurgence, because Voice of Resurgence does see some play in Modern as well, and like Hate Bears and stuff like that. But Pillar is going to allow us to exile any creature with 2 or less toughness that is going to have like enter the battlefield or leave the battlefield abilities, or like a combo of the both, like whenever it leaves it comes back and then it has like an enter the battlefield ability, something like Kitchen Finks. So Pillar of Flame lets us get rid of those smaller creatures with interactions like that, and just as a burn spell, it's going to deal 2 damage for 1 red at a sorcery speed to our opponent if we want to direct it at our opponent or try to redirect it to a planeswalker or something like that. We have 2 Burst Lightning, which is going to deal 2 damage to target creature or player, and it has a kicker for 4. If we pay it, it's going to deal 4 damage to that creature or player instead. Pretty perfect in terms of like late game situations where we're just trying to burn out our opponent and we're just trying to get those final few points in to actually win the game. Burst Lightning can definitely do that for us, but early game it's just a shock, and it's a pretty good one at that. Having a variable shock is definitely really nice. And then getting into our land base here, we have some fetches, some shocks, 2 check lands, we have a set of Mutavault, and we have some basics. So going over it, we have a playset of Scalding Tarn, which is going to allow us to search for our Shocklands, or it's going to allow us to search for our islands or our Singleton Mountain. We have 3 Misty Rainforest, which I actually have 2 proxies of, because that's the only fetch land that I don't have a playset of at the moment, so I have to borrow copies whenever I'm playing this deck. But Misty Rainforest allows us to search for our Shocklands that have a island subtype. It's going to allow us to search for our breeding pool or just for our islands. We have a playset of Steam Vents, just providing red and blue for us. Just a singleton breeding pool, because we do have some green spells in our sideboard that I like to have that splash for. Even though this is just a solely blue and red deck, blue-red Faeries, we do still have that little splash of green for stuff like Ancient Grudge and Back to Nature, which I really like to play in this type of a deck. I have 2 Sulfur Falls for the check lands. The playset of Mutavault to allow us to have another fairy creature on the board. It's also another 2/2 body that's going to swing in, which it's just well-rounded for that type of a card. It doesn't set us too far back that we're having a 4 of for a land that doesn't provide mana. We have a 4 of for just basic islands, and then 1 Singleton Mountain. So that's the main board for Blue-Red Faeries. Now let's jump over and take a look at the sideboard. So for our sideboard here, the first card that we have is Engineered Explosives, and on camera you guys will see that that's another card that I have a proxy of that I have to borrow 1 copy for whenever I'm playing this deck. But Engineered Explosives is awesome because it's going to allow us to play up against matchups like Slippery Boggle, where we're able to destroy their enchantments and their creatures, or just aggro flat out, or anything that has a lot of like creatures or permanents with the same converted mana cost. Engineered Explosive is awesome. It's an X-cost card with Sunburst, and we pay 2 mana and we sack the Engineered Explosives, and we destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on Engineered Explosives. So it's going to allow us just to blow up a lot of stuff flat out with it. We have to make sure that it's not blowing up way too much of our stuff, but usually with Engineered Explosives it's going to be to slow down aggro, blow up Boggle, and not allow them to use their variety of hexproof creatures and enchantments that are going to enchant them. So Engineered Explosives is awesome for that. We have a Singleton Spellskite, so this is up against, like, again, Boggle. If Boggle ends up being like a thing in the meta and somebody brings a Boggle deck, I can side in Spellskite. It's also good against Infect because we can just start taking their pump spells. Spellskite's also pretty alright whenever it comes to playing against decks that have some sort of tempo going on to them, just because it's a blocker, and at the same time, if our opponent has like any Lightning Bolts or Path to Exiles, we can just redirect them to Spellskite and keep our other creatures intact. I have a Singleton Back to Nature, which was one of the reasons why I wanted to splash green, and this is for pretty much entirely the Boggle matchup, just to be able to destroy all of their enchantments just for 2 mana. That's a lot of value, especially when they declare attackers. We can respond with Back to Nature and then potentially declare blockers and set our opponent to a huge disadvantage. I also have 2 Ancient Grudge, which is another reason why I want to splash that green in there. So it's just 2 mana, and it's at an instant speed to destroy target artifact, flashback for 1 green. So this is good up against matchups where our opponent's running a lot of artifact creatures or a lot of value artifacts. So up against Affinity, Ancient Grudge is obviously really, really good. But another matchup where Ancient Grudge is actually pretty good is against Tron, to be able to get rid of their Mind Stones. It's also a value card if we need to get rid of Wormcoil Engine if they happen to resolve it. I think that being able to break the Wormcoil Engine down from a 6/6 into 2 3/3s and then use Ancient Grudge to flashback and get rid of one of those 3/3s is much more easy to handle than just that big 6/6 that whenever it dies, it's just going to come back as those 2 3/3s. So Ancient Grudge is good for that. Against Tron, Ancient Grudge is probably the main thing that I have for like Mind Stones, because I don't want my opponent using Mind Stones. That and Mind Slaver if they don't have the mana open to actually use it. So against those bigger artifacts, Ancient Grudge is awesome. I have 1 Negate, so this is up against decks that run a lot of non-creature spells, anything like Control, to decks that are going to try to cast a lot of really expensive non-creature spells really early on to be able to overwhelm us, anything like Planeswalkers. So the Negate is going to be valued to be able to counter things as a hard counter. We have one Graffdigger's Cage, so this is up against matchups like Living End, anything like Unburial Rites with like gifts. So it's going to prevent our opponent from having creatures enter the battlefield from graveyards. So against like Living End, that's definitely what we want to be using up against them, so that they can't just Living End and get their entire graveyard back onto the battlefield and just barf it onto the table. It's also going to prevent our opponent from searching and putting creatures onto the battlefield from libraries as well. So up against Court of Calling, Graffdigger's Cage is also pretty good. And players can't cast cards from graveyards or libraries, so if that happens to apply, it's also going to hit that as well. I have two Relic of Progenitus, so the Relic of Progenitus is again for like the graveyard synergy matchups, anything from like Storm to Living End to Unburial Gifts. A lot of those matchups you just want to have Relic of Progenitus to keep things in check, and it does a pretty good job at that, being able to exile all graveyards, and we also get to draw a card whenever we crack it, so eggs are really good to have in this type of a deck to just keep on drawing things. I have a 3-up for Blood Moon, so non-basic lands or mountains, so you can side this in not just for Tron, but for any matchup where our opponent's running a lot of non-basic lands. Like if their entire mana base is non-basic lands, then we can just side in Blood Moon and just completely throw off the mana that they're able to produce, like especially in control-based decks like Blue, White, Red. If they aren't running a lot of basics and they're not fetching for them, we just play Blood Moon and all they can produce is red mana, which will generally really suck for them. And then we have two Spreading Seas. So Spreading Seas is going to enchant a land, the enchanted land is an island, and we get to draw a card off of it. So it's a cantrip, but at the same time it provides another two cards that we can side in against Tron that are going to be faster than Blood Moon. So we can play Spreading Seas and keep them from like assembling Voltron on turn 3 and potentially playing something big, or buying us some time to actually get our Blood Moon before they can actually get anything going. And then we can throw Blood Moon down and be able to just throw off all of their Urza lands. So it's definitely really good for that, and having the 5 cards of hate for Tron is consistent, it's good, it's exactly what you want because Tron is so annoying. So that is the sideboard that we have for Blue-Red Fairies, and that's the deck tech for Blue-Red Fairies. The entire deck list is down below where you guys can check it out and use it as a reference. Also be sure to check out the playlist in the description like I mentioned before. Remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more Magic the Gathering videos, deck techs, and all that kind of cool stuff. And until next time guys, have yourselves a wonderful, fun-filled Magic the Gathering day.